I distinctly remember the first time I went to a VR arcade. The VR headset was placed directly in front of me, and I slowly walked over and picked up the headset, unknowing what was going to happen next. I put it on, and the headset was powered off unbeknownst to me, so I was staring on a pitch-black void. Then suddenly, I was transported into another world. I was in space. I looked around and noticed whenever I turned to look or move in any direction, it would update in real time, to the point where it almost felt like reality, only in an altered state. I know it sounds corny as hell for most people who haven't tried virtual reality, but it's something you can barely put into words or visualize through a 2D screen. I remember the first game I played on VR, that being Job Simulator, and honestly this was the perfect introduction to VR gaming. You're placed in a small cubicle and you have to complete incremental tasks. And in order to complete these tasks, you have to physically move around and interact with objects. I must say, that as simple as this concept sounds on paper, words cannot really do it justice for what you're experiencing within a VR environment. It's an effect that cannot be replicated on a flat screen counterpart. Flat screen games can use physics environments, but it doesn't beat the sense of actually physically picking up objects and interacting with them in VR. Because in flat screen games, you press buttons on a controller or a keyboard, as opposed to actually grabbing them. Things like physically aligning sights of a gun to a target, then firing away, or reloading, then physically grabbing the slide of a gun to rack it back. All you need to know is that VR games have a physical action as opposed to a key or button press. As a result of this, your movement becomes akin to the game you're playing. I noticed this when I rewatched a recording of my VR gameplay, waving to a new character's appearance, or looking in and out of the scope to see my surroundings, similar to how you would in a flat screen counterpart. VR doesn't just make you immersed, it creates this illusion where you're physically placed into these worlds and environments, and that's exactly why it's perfect for seeing games you've played in new perspectives. The Minecraft mod Vivecraft does exactly that, porting the entire game into a VR medium, adding physicality to almost every normal Minecraft action, and genuinely, it's like experiencing the game for the first time again. Every little action seems so much more deliberate and meaningful than it normally would. Things like physically punching down a tree, physically crafting stuff, grabbing stuff out of a backpack, and seeing the scale of the world is something that surprised me when playing. Everything is so much larger than I thought it would be, especially when looking down a massive ravine or building something, and seeing how high I am up in comparison to the ground. The feeling I felt when I saw the sun setting for the first time was a similar feeling I and many others had on their first Minecraft night. I mean, you remember how terrifying it was, right? There was this urge to seek any sort of safety within the night. It was my top priority. So you know what I did? I did the classic overnight cave base. And now that I mention it, this shows that horror in VR can be very powerful. Now I know Minecraft is far from a horror game, so I had the courage to try Phasmophobia in VR, alone. And honestly, I was not looking forward to it. Phasmophobia as a game is already a fairly scary game, so in VR, it was only bound to make it scarier. As I loaded into the game, I grabbed my ghost hunting gear, and as I was approaching the house, I felt this anguish, and the closer I got, the more intense the feeling got. It's not just a house on a 2D monitor. For me, this house is practically real, because I am physically placed into the game world. I'm now face to face with the door of the house, and I slowly peek it open. And what I am met with is just a pitch black void. Now darkness in flat screen games can be terrifying on their own, but when you're in the game world actually experiencing that darkness, and your entire vision is bombarded with darkness, only admitted by a small flashlight, it increases that fear by tenfold. Being in such an environment is a testament to how VR can make us experience things that we wouldn't experience otherwise. One problem with VR horror games, though that I don't really see mentioned often, is that they're so few and far between. It sucks because there are definitely some horror games that I would love to experience in VR, but to put time and effort into porting your game into VR is no easy task. But most if not all flat screen game genres have been ported somewhat into VR, most notably sandbox games. VR sandbox games are the pinnacle of a great VR experience. Games like Boneworks, Bone Lab, or Blade and Sorcery answer the question of what if every object that looks interactable with the world or the player itself is interactable, and it does a hell of a great job of doing so. Boneworks is the first game to fully encapsulate this. Early VR titles had a rough time making mechanics that felt natural, so most games of this time focused on mastering a single mechanic that would be the focal point of the game. So Boneworks is the first of its kind to take all those mechanics, fine-tune them, and finally combine them into a gem of a game. Seriously, everything about this game feels so natural. The guns, the melee, the combat, the physics. Everything feels like it has some sort of tactility to it. It feels like objects have a certain mass and attributes that make you say, hey, that looks heavy. And indeed, it actually is heavy. It's a really odd feeling to actually, quote-unquote, feel weight in VR. For example, whenever you put your hand to a wall, there's resistance that blocks you from putting your hands through it. And since this game is physics-based, every object that looks like you can pick it up, you can. Puzzles in games are always something I've loved, especially physics puzzles in games like Portal or Half-Life. but Boneworks reimagines these puzzles in a way I've never seen before. VR physics puzzles is such a unique idea, and it can allow for creativity to flow with the puzzles. And on many occasions, there isn't just one way to complete these puzzles. There are almost unlimited possibilities, it just comes down to how you play the game. And the combat in these games is very interesting. And at a difficulty standpoint, it isn't really there, but the fun in having physical enemies is you could do whatever the hell you want. Create your own combo moves, create your own finishers, fucking send them to the stratosphere because it gave you a funny look. It's all up to you because of the free will VR gives you. There's no specific set of animations or type of attacks that holds you back. You get to create them, and that's the beauty of it. But as good as everything I've mentioned sounds, VR as a whole is not all positive, and has some problems. Most notably motion sickness. If you've ever used the VR headset, it's likely you've encountered this issue before. The nauseating feeling you get whenever simulated movement does not align to what's happening in the real world. This is an issue that's still ongoing, and developers have been trying to find solutions using different movement types. But in reality, I believe it's an issue that can only be solved with advanced tech. Another issue VR faces today is the lack of AAA games. Now for me, I don't necessarily see a problem with this because, well, I don't know if you know this, but AAA has not had a good track record as of late. But VR is massively focused on indie games because having a AAA studio developing a VR game is not something that usually happens due to the lack of demand for something like that. But in spite of this, there was one company that managed to pull it off. That company being Valve. Valve is known for innovating in the industry and creating some of the most influential games of all time. So Valve creating a VR game would blow everything out of the water. So that's exactly what they did. Along with this game with insane fidelity for a VR game, they would unveil tech specifically designed and curated for the game, that being a headset named the Valve Index. This headset was a lifeline for the game, as without it, Half-Life Alyx would have not been possible. Half-Life Alyx is the first story-driven VR game, and without spoiling it, I think they did a damn good job. Half-Life Alyx is known today as, I'd say, the best VR game of all time, and I can understand why. The details in this game are pretty insane. Shaking certain items will have corresponding sounds. If you shake a matchbox, you can hear them rattling around in the box, or a spray paint can will do the same too. Details like this makes Half-Life Alyx one of a kind. I've always thought of VR as this new technology, but really, it's far from it. The first illustration of VR goes as far back as the 1930s. VR was just a mere concept, an idea. But a bit later down the line, in 1968, the first real VR head-mounted display was created by just two guys, Ivan Sutherland and Bob Sproul. Of course, this VR device is very limited in what it could do. It could only display 3D wireframe shapes, but at the time, this was revolutionary. As VR continued to develop, many companies realized the potential and the uses of VR devices. Over time, flight simulators, the ability to control a rover that is on another planet, and even in the 90s, the first gaming VR headsets were created. Though after all this time, VR was not a thing that consumers could experience. VR was far too expensive and bulky. But in 2014, this would all change. Facebook would go on to buy Oculus, a VR company, for $2 billion. This would cause the VR industry to grow exponentially fast. And this would open a new consumer market of VR devices that was never a thing prior. Things like Google Cardboard and makeshift VR devices were just the start of the consumer market. Of course, Google Cardboard isn't at all comparable to what we have today, and not many people know that. Today we have headsets like the Oculus Quest 2, which is to this day, still a fantastic feat. It's the most affordable good VR headset we have today, and I've had mine for over 2 years. And in conjunction with the PC, it's pretty much timeless. A lot of people would call 2019 the golden age of VR, because of the new releases of so many great VR titles and new headsets in such a short time frame. Whereas now, a new VR game is like a Bigfoot sighting, and new headsets, while they are coming out, do I really need to spend $400 on a headset with slightly better resolution and slightly better hardware? No, I'm waiting for that big push that VR desperately needs. It's not like new old headsets, where there's a drastic difference in headsets. Today it's more like, hey, here's an iPhone 12. 13? 14? No, okay, how about this? iPhone 14s. See, there's no innovation with today's headsets. But to be fair, I think I'm dreaming a bit too far ahead. It's like having a Nokia and wishing you had an iPhone, okay? It's too far in the future. But this makes me wonder, what is the future of VR going to look like? Are we finally going to be seeing the VR headset of my dreams for a reasonable price? Or are we going to live in a dystopia where everyone's using VR and has no time for reality? I don't know. But what I do know is VR is a really cool technology that I hope keeps evolving. Oh, and welcome back, by the way.